Welcome to a special edition of the Sharp Football Show, the free agency special, if it were. We're going to be talking with Ray Summerlin, Rich Hribar, and myself, breaking down some of the biggest moves in free agency. Rich hasn't been a big fan of this free agent class, and for good reason. There's not a whole lot of really compelling changes that have been made on the offensive side of the ball that are really going to massively impact or turn over the world in the fantasy football space. But Rich still has some interesting thoughts and breakdowns on some of these players that have been moving around. And so we're going to be going over all of these with you here over the course of the next 45 minutes to an hour. Just a reminder, if you're joining us over on X and catching the stream there, you know X has been going crazy. X was down forever yesterday morning. You need to make sure that you're following us over on YouTube. So we're at the Sharp Football Analysis channel over on YouTube. Go over there, subscribe to the channel, give this show a thumbs up. And as always, we're going to be interacting with your comments over in the comment section. So if you guys want to post some interesting comments, some feedback, some of your thoughts on free agency, 2 questions that I've got for you guys that you need to answer in the comment section that we will interact with. Number 1, what has been your favorite free agent signing thus far? What has made the most sense to you, not just for your team, but what has made the most sense to you around the league? And then what is a free agent signing that has puzzled you, has confused you, that you do not think makes a lot of sense? So why don't you chime in the comment section there? And of course, head on over while you're here to sharp.football and sign up for our free newsletter. It's a way to keep connected with us all off season long. You can sign up for free over at sharp.football. With that said, Ray, Rich, how are you guys doing today on a nice Tuesday morning?
I'll be honest, I'm tired. I won't lie to you. I lie to you about that. They decided that we couldn't even have our Sunday night before free agency anymore. We couldn't even have that precious weekend that we had before free agency with with some of the moves were made, some of which we'll talk about now, some of which we probably won't talk a lot about today. Rich and I will save for the fantasy podcast that we'll do on Thursday, actually at the same time on Thursday. So make sure you subscribe, stay tuned for that. We'll go a lot more into DK Metcalf and guys like that for sure. But ultimately, yeah, it was a really interesting day. I'm interested to talk about several teams that went big. I'm interested to talk about the Jaguars, who didn't actually go that big. They made a couple of big signings, but they just appeared to sign every mid-tier free agent that was available, which is an interesting kind of approach and says a little bit about what they felt about their roster. So there's lots of stuff going on. There's lots of interesting things, and so I'm excited to break it down.
It was a hot start yesterday. A lot of action for Ray. I didn't really have a lot of on my plate with the fantasy stuff, but so I got to just keep my head down and keep plugging away on rookie stuff. But yeah, it was an interesting start for sure. I mean, I think with the cap going up and this being a lighter free agent class, we saw a lot of exorbitant spending. We'll see kind of how the return is when we go down the line here. I mean, I treat free agency always like there's always like 3 buckets of free agents. You have kind of that veteran underperforming player in a high contract that becomes like a cap casualty, think like this year, like a guy like Harold Landry, right? You either have a guy coming off of a career year in a contract year. You think of a guy like Milton Williams, or like a lackluster kind of return on like a lower end rookie capital, like almost like a Josh Palmer type like that. Usually 3 buckets of guys always available in the free agent market. Very rarely are great players in their prime available in free agency. So when you usually see teams spend a lot of money, it is teams that usually have a lot of money and they're in a bad spot and are forced to overpay, like, the New England Patriots for kind of just like pedestrian, what looks like pedestrian signings. So we'll see how that works out. But typically, I don't believe anything has ever won in this period of the NFL offseason, though, even though people love guys changing uniforms.
No, it actually is. It actually more is lost in this period than is won. When you think about free agents, the type of players that enter free agency for the most part are players that haven't proven enough to their current team to have them re-sign that player. And there's a rare occasion where some guys outperform massively their contract, can't come to a deal. The team that they're on has spending difficulties, although in today's modern football, it's so much easier to create cap space and to find a way to pay a guy that you need to retain. And so you've got a lot of guys that are leaving, and they're leaving at the peak of their market because they excelled with their current team in a scheme that was designed to allow them to excel, to get those great statistics. And then they're going to be switching schemes, potentially going somewhere else to a staff that is brand new, may not be as familiar with their positives or negatives. And then they're going to perform to a lower level than they were on their regular team, but they're going to be doing so that lower level of performance at a much higher price tag. And so it definitely, you get, if you spend a lot in free agency, you tend to get, from a winning perspective, a quick short-term bump. Maybe that next year you get 1 to 1.5 more wins, but it ends up costing you in the long run for those teams. That performance then, once that first year, these guys are generally signed to 2+ year deals. That second year, that cap hit is significantly higher and the performance is not nearly as good. And those teams tend to struggle in year 2 after maybe a slight performance bump from these teams that tend to sign a lot of players.
Speaking of, like, we're talking about this like in the abstract, I do think, especially since we're having news break right before, well, not right before, but pretty soon before we did this on Tuesday morning, we saw that the Colts signed Daniel Jones. And I really like the idea of Daniel Jones as we're talking about kind of just kind of players. I like going straight to talk about Daniel Jones, who's signing with the Colts, which is interesting. I do think from a fantasy perspective, Rich, and I'll ask you kind of about that here in a second. But Warren, you've already posted in the Slack a treatsy, I would call it, on Daniel Jones. And so I would like to just kind of to let you go on Daniel Jones and kind of your thoughts on this signing for the Colts.
Yeah, look, I don't love Daniel Jones as a quarterback. Daniel Jones certainly has his deficiencies. What the Giants fell into the trap of back in the 2023 offseason, prior to the 2023 season, was looking at the wins and losses from the 2022 Giants and the way that they went to the playoffs and beat the Minnesota Vikings in an upset on the road as Daniel Jones could actually win games for us. We're winning games because of Daniel Jones. The way that the 2022 New York Giants won those games was because they limited Daniel Jones. They put Daniel Jones off to the side and tried to work around Daniel Jones. And they did that in a number of ways. Number one, they lowered their passing rate in between the 20s. They increased Daniel Jones' rushing of the football, his scrambling of the football. And then when they got down into the red zone, which was one of their biggest struggles back in the 2021 season, in 2022, they massively increased their running back run rate, and they massively lowered Daniel Jones' target depth so that he could actually complete passes there inside of the red zone. He averaged only 3.9 air yards per attempt, but overall his statistics, I posted this, and Giants fans hated me for this analysis because they thought that they were on the right track. There are some Giants fans that did not want to sign Daniel Jones, but for the most part, they all tended to fall in line with the team that we got to keep this guy. We're doing pretty good. Let's see what we can go with this. But what ended up happening then, other teams saw what Brian Daboll was doing with Daniel Jones in terms of playing him in a limited capacity so that Daniel Jones just didn't make mistakes. If you remember, like back in 2021 and 2020, Daniel Jones would just get sacked and fumble the ball all the time. I mean, he lost so many fumbles inside of the pocket. So they limited his negatives. And I think Brian Daboll said, look, if we're going to try to win games with this guy, and Joe Schoen thinks that this guy is our franchise quarterback, we got to open things up a little bit. Let's try to let Daniel Jones be our QB1 as opposed to really limiting him. And that did not go so well. Over the last 2 years in New York, Daniel Jones has basically played 16 games. He's had 16 starts in New York. They're 3-13 in those games. And Daniel Jones' stats over the last 2 years in those 16 games, out of 45 qualifying quarterbacks, he ranks 40th or lower in all of these stats. Yards per attempt at 5.9, EPA per attempt, sack plus interception rate, touchdown to interception ratio, explosive gain rate only 6%, and sack rate per pressure, which is definitely a problem. 27% of his pressures does he take a sack on. Now, he's going to compete with Anthony Richardson for the Indianapolis Colts. The biggest issue with Anthony Richardson is the guy cannot complete a forward pass. That's a problem if you're a quarterback. His completion rate is one of the all-time worst in the NFL. He's been terrible in that regard. But the way that Shane Steichen has utilized Anthony Richardson is vastly different than the way that Brian Daboll was utilizing Daniel Jones. Anthony Richardson's air yards per attempt is 11.2 over the last 2 seasons. That's by far number 1 highest in the NFL. Daniel Jones is down at 7.2, which is 32nd in the NFL. The rate at which Anthony Richardson throws the ball beyond the sticks is number 1 in the NFL. 45% of his passes travel beyond the sticks. For Daniel Jones, only 28% travel beyond the sticks. That ranked 42 out of 45 quarterbacks. So you got the number 1 guy who throws the ball beyond the sticks in Anthony Richardson versus the number 42 guy who throws the ball beyond the sticks in terms of Daniel Jones. The way I look at this, Ray, is simple to me. If we have Shane Steichen dial back his offense to play to the strengths of Daniel Jones and avoid the weaknesses of Daniel Jones and do more of like the 2022 Brian Daboll style of offense, where we're not going to try to ask this guy to do too much or be a QB1 or be a franchise quarterback. We're just going to try to win games with this guy so that I can retain my job. I'm not going to get fired. If they try to do something like the 2022 New York Giants, I have no doubt of 2 things. Number 1, Daniel Jones, like when they're practicing in t-shirts without pads, he's going to complete more passes. He's probably going to look a little better than Anthony Richardson. And he might even, when Anthony Richardson goes out there, if he does start the first few weeks, I could definitely expect that Daniel Jones will probably be a guy that you might want to pivot to and say, this guy looks actually a little bit better than Anthony Richardson. The other thing that I believe is that the Colts can win some games with Daniel Jones if they're playing like the 2022 Brian Daboll New York Giants played it from a play calling and a philosophical perspective. So I think they could win a few games with Daniel Jones, and I think he might look a little bit better than Anthony Richardson, but he's not a good quarterback. He's just not a good quarterback, and that's my take on him.
They also kind of found themselves where they are with Anthony Richardson and everything that happened with Anthony Richardson last year, of like people in the organization. You know, you think about kind of some of the stuff that Pat McAfee said about it, and I don't think, you know, his connections with that organization, I don't think that probably came out of left field, you know, with people questioning Richardson with the weird injury stuff. Like, this does really feel like they're out on Richardson. And to your point, we just actually got a tweet, I believe, from Tom Pelissero talking about how the Colts are setting up for a quarterback competition. Kind of what you would want to do with Daniel Jones is probably not what you would want to do for Anthony Richardson. And so, you know, depending on how they set this up, they might be playing to one guy over the other. Rich, the fantasy part of this is, I think probably a lot of us who, you know, believe strongly in the Konami code have held out some hope for Anthony Richardson. If we could see that passing improve, could he kind of hold on to the job and be, you know, a very viable fantasy quarterback because of that rushing production? But ironically, he seems like he's headed to the same kind of environment that we have with Justin Fields. And where Justin Fields, when he was with the Bears, was actually a very good fantasy player and had some massive fantasy games. Richardson hasn't quite hit that ceiling yet, but he just didn't have the job security to kind of maintain it over a full season with the Steelers last year. You know, we didn't really see it with the Bears as well the season before. And you're constantly, especially if you're playing in dynasty leagues, living in that limbo. And I think kind of them adding Daniel Jones here, you know, them giving him what they give him, like, it just, everything continues to point to me that the Colts, they're out already. And that's like, if you're trying to invest in Anthony Richardson in dynasty or in season long, it doesn't seem like it's going to work out for him in Indianapolis. And we'll just kind of have to see where the rest of his career takes him. What are your thoughts on that?
We went in length on Anthony Richardson when we did the Dynasty Rankings show on the update. I think that might be the last time you and I did like a fantasy podcast too. But we went in length on, you know, Anthony Richardson and how he was in kind of that purgatory now, because you have to win as a passer in the NFL to sustain, you know, getting second contracts and having a franchise turn the keys over to you. And that doesn't seem like the Colts what they want to do yet, because we haven't seen that as a passer. And it goes back into his collegiate profile and his high school profile. Very rarely do you see inaccurate passers just become accurate passers. Like, it's just one of the things that don't really happen. Like, we can all chase Josh Allen, right? Like, but you know, there's only one Josh Allen. So like,
Anthony Richardson is literally chasing Josh Allen because he's using the same coach this offseason. Like, that was the big offseason news. Like, he's literally chasing Josh Allen, which I hope it works out for him. But yeah, that's where we are in kind of the Anthony Richardson land, what he's trying to do.
But definitely check out that show where we went in length and talked about why he was one of the biggest fallers in dynasty circles. But just look at last year, Warren talked about, him pushing the ball downfield. He completed just 60.3% of his passes on throws under 10 yards downfield. That was the lowest rate in a season for a quarterback that's thrown 100 more passes since CJ Beathard in 2017, or Beat Hard, as Ray likes to refer to him as. Then you look at on throws over 10 yards downfield, he only completed 34.4%, the lowest rate in the league. The only seasons with a lower rate since 2010 were Deshaun Kaiser and Tim Tebow. So, that's the kind of company we have with Anthony Richardson. He's still just a complete project, and he's so raw as a passer, and you just can't expect that to turn on. That flip doesn't, that switch doesn't flip for as many people as you think it like to believe it does. So the funny thing is, going to Daniel Jones, who is the worst rated quarterback in the NFL, that qualifies for pass rating the past 2 years, like Warren alluded to, you would want more stability. I think you'd want more of a better passer in this situation. But sometimes if you want your backup to come in and kind of run a similar offense, you're looking at another quarterback that really can't complete passes.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see kind of where they go from here. I do guess, because I brought him up in kind of the fantasy similarities here for, Fields is a better passer than Anthony Richardson for sure. But the fantasy similarities in holding jobs and stuff like that does bring us to Justin Fields, who, Warren, you wrote a long thing about the Steelers ahead of free agency when it looked like they were going to re-sign Fields. They then make that big trade for DK Metcalf. And again, Richard and I will probably talk about that more on Thursday's show. But then Justin Fields decides to leave. He decides to go to the Jets. They give him 2 years, $40 million. I think it's understandable from his point of view. The Steelers, bailed on him 7 weeks into the season for Russell Wilson, even though that, I think in our opinion, was probably the right decision. You could see why he wouldn't, want to stick around, maybe didn't feel wanted, and left to go to the Jets. But I think from your point of view, Warren, and kind of what I saw you tweeting about this is for you, a kind of questionable decision for the Jets about, and looking at kind of where they might be headed moving forward.
Yeah, and one last quick point. I'll talk about the New York Jets and Justin Fields in a second, but I just want to add that it really does come down to the way that Shane Steichen wants to coach this team. Right now, there's a very realistic chance that he's coaching for his job. If he does not produce some more positives there, that owner is not going to really stand for a coach continuing to flounder. As crazy as he is, Jim Irsay wants a team that's going to get to the playoffs and win some games. And when you look at that division that they're in, the AFC South, I mean, it's not as if there's some sort of juggernaut standing in their way. So he doesn't have much patience. And I absolutely believe that there's a chance that Daniel Jones simply, if the offense is tailored to his strengths, he's going to look substantially better. But getting back to Justin Fields, and obviously they're going to have to tailor the offense in New York to his strengths. But it is just so weird. I don't know if you guys get this sense or not, or maybe it's just because I've been vocal in my objective criticism of Justin Fields. But there's just this, and Rich, you're from the Ohio area. Maybe it's like an Ohio State thing, or I don't know what. There's just this group of fans that are so bought into Justin Fields, and they still believe Justin Fields can be the guy, is the guy right now. He should get his chances. He's one of the best. He's got, not best in the NFL, but he's got this untapped upside potential that just no other coach has been able to get out of him so far in the NFL. And I get it. He hasn't been around. He hasn't been plugged into great offenses. He hasn't been working with the best offensive coordinators in the NFL. But Justin Fields, his game is certainly lacking. I wrote a big article about the Pittsburgh Steelers and where they have found themselves since it became clear that Ben Roethlisberger was not long for the NFL. He was talking about retirement, and the Pittsburgh Steelers made no real moves to try to find his replacement at all during the time that Ben Roethlisberger was talking year after year, every single offseason, or sitting on the bench after they lose in the playoffs, crying with Cam Hayward, with his starting center, about he's going to be long. He's going to be short for the game. He's probably going to be leaving soon. He's old. He's in his late 30s, and they're doing nothing to replace him. And so the Steelers made their own bed. They go out and draft Kenny Pickett after Ben Roethlisberger retired, and they've just been floundering ever since. They still have not signed a quarterback right now. But if you look at Justin Fields, this is just a quarterback, through part of the article. Last year, I know the Steelers had a successful win-loss record with Justin Fields in the game. Justin Fields, out of 43 qualifying quarterbacks, now granted, he played like 6 games, okay? Ranked 36 out of 43 in EPA per attempt on early downs, 34 in success rate, 28 in yards per attempt. He had the slowest time to throw in the NFL. It was actually an improvement over his time to throw in years past, but it was still the slowest of any quarterback in the NFL, 2.7 seconds per pass attempt on early downs. He had the worst in the NFL boom to bust rate. Boom means that you threw a pass and it gained at least 1 expected point. Bust means you threw a pass and it lost at least -1 expected points. No quarterback had a worse boom to bust ratio than did Justin Fields. He was 43rd in the NFL. He was the number 3 worst at his bust rate. So he had a ton of plays where he had -1 EPA or worse on the field. When he was under pressure, he struggled. Let's see. When he was trying to throw the ball deep down the field, I know that he has shown some glimpses of throwing the ball down the field. And you got all these people with well-known platforms talking about how great Justin Fields is passing the ball down the field. Last year, when he threw the ball 15 plus yards down the field, he averaged 34% success, 34th in success rate out of 43, 35th in yards per attempt, 29th in EPA per attempt. Russell Wilson was top 10 in all of those with the same exact offense. And you remember, we saw like the explosions from their number 1 wide receiver, George Pickens, getting really upset on the field. This is when Justin Fields was his quarterback. Like, the guy was about to rip somebody's head off, and he was trying to catch these balls down the field. All of a sudden, Russ comes in, ranks number 1 in EPA per attempt when throwing the ball 15 plus yards down the field, and number 3 in yards per attempt. And George Pickens is actually being somewhat productive to close the season. So I just am not a believer in Justin Fields. I don't believe the fans and his fan base that think that he is a quarterback that just needs the right coaching and all of a sudden he's going to be a breakout. I just don't see that. But I'm guessing that Rich is going to say, because of his running ability, he has a higher floor than most quarterbacks. And I will not argue with him at all in that regard. If a coach comes in and tries to utilize Justin Fields from a scrambling or a design runs perspective, that's what is going to probably deliver the best chance for the New York Jets to actually win games with him. But I just don't believe in him as a passing quarterback.
You'd say you, Rich. I mean, like, I was going to ask basically the same idea, which is, you and I look at a lot of things from, especially when we're talking about, offensive players. We're looking at it from a fantasy perspective. And Justin Fields over the first 6 weeks last year was the QB7 in points per game. Now he had 1 spike week that changed that over a 6-week sample. If I'm remembering correctly, he was running pretty hot on rushing touchdowns over that span. And so there's, there's some mitigating factors there. But we also have seen him in the past be that kind of that fantasy guy. I think from a offensive philosophy perspective, it's interesting because I don't actually think we know a lot about Tanner Engstrand and what he wants to do. And so that's something I'm going to really dig into and try to figure out as we move through the offseason. But yeah, I mean, ultimately he at least gives you one thing, and we're not talking about his passing at the level of like Anthony Richardson. It's certainly better than that. And so ultimately, maybe he holds on to this job, or maybe, maybe Tyrod Taylor is starting in week 7. I believe that's where Tyrod is, right? With the Jets. Yes. And so, yeah, it's an interesting situation. Where do you stand on it?
Yeah, I think given the Jets' options this season, this was probably the path that was the least evil path to take. I definitely don't believe Justin Fields is a quarterback big picture that I believe in, like Warren, big long term. But I think when you look at the money and the commitment here, also Justin Fields' best performances typically came against Aaron Glenn. So if he can get a bunch of people to play a bunch of man coverage and use his rushing ability, that'd be great. But you do see some of that in free agency, right? Like when a guy roasts a coach or something, they'll go out and get that player, right? And Justin Fields, like I said, had his best moments against Aaron Glenn for sure. But I think when you look at the money too and the commitment, we'll see what the actual contract is. That's the other thing with a lot of these deals that have been announced so far. And people are like, look at this money. Like, let's wait and see like what's actually real. But because Justin Fields right now, considering his age, like got his own kind of tax bracket at the quarterback position. Like he was under the Geno Smith, Sam Darnold tier, above kind of like the Gardner Minshew tier of a year ago. So I think it's just a mid-range commitment. It's to kind of see what they have this year. And for us in like in the fantasy world, it's great because them just getting a regular pocket passer probably wasn't going to do anything. And at least if we're going to get a guy that can run the ball 100 times, he's going to be relevant. So it just adds another relevant kind of player to the player pool that matters for us versus them doing something like getting a Gardner Minshew, right? Maybe they could have stayed put at 7. We're going to talk about a couple of these teams, right? That just one, you have this draft class that at the quarterback position, it's a little bit lackluster. We're not expecting Cam Ward to last long. So then we're into where does Shedeur Sanders go? Where does Jaxon Dart go? If you don't like either of those players, what do? Your hands are tied. If you do like one of those players, like the Raiders could have been like, but you're picking 6 or 7, do they even get there? You don't know. So they're kind of in limbo. So I do think that this path that the Jets took, considering of all the options, I think short term makes a lot more sense than what some of these other teams have done.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was with Justin Fields when we were talking last week, I guess, about the idea that he was going to go back to the Steelers. And we can get to the Steelers and the Giants and, what are they going to do kind of moving forward here in a little bit. But yeah, like ultimately when you look at the options presented to you, you can talk a lot about all of the missteps that have led you to this point, which we will do with the Giants and with the Steelers and with the Jets and all of those things. But you operate in this current reality, right? And in this current reality, you need a quarterback. And if Justin Fields at least has what you perceive as upside and has a skill that he can use, and you can lean more heavily on Breece Hall in the running game, and he has that connection with Garrett Wilson, and maybe you try to narrative street your way into that working out, right? Then yeah, I can.
They
I
didn't
can
have a ton
understand.
of overlap though.
Fair enough, but narrative street doesn't care about facts, right?
How about Jeremy
It is
Ruckert? This is Jeremy Ruckert, Ohio State erasure.
This is all vibes and feelings when we do narrative street. So we don't deal with facts on narrative street. But
I agree.
But yeah,
I agree with both. I agree with both of you guys. They're going to win some games with Justin Fields, and it wasn't the worst signing in the world. Like I don't believe Justin Fields should be out of the NFL. And to your point, it's going to be really fascinating to see what that offense coordinator tries to do from a philosophical perspective and from a scheme perspective here. And you're right, Ray. We're going to dig into that a ton over the coming months.
Yeah, worked for Jim Harbaugh at San Diego State. He was under Ben Johnson last year with the Lions. So it's gonna be interesting to see like kind of what he carries over from those two coaches for sure.
Yeah, that's kind of my point about him. And this isn't the spot to talk about that. As Warren said, if you get the 2025 preview book, there'll be a lot more written about him and trying to dig into what he said, his quotes, and trying to figure it out. But yeah, he has that long ago connection to Jim Harbaugh as a graduate assistant at San Diego, and then he's under Ben Johnson in Detroit. But Detroit, when they worked together, I believe Ben Johnson was in Detroit whenever Engstrand got there, but he, like Ben Johnson wasn't the offensive coordinator at that point. They were kind of on staff together, and then Ben Johnson gets promoted. So you also don't know how much that connection is, and that's why I think that'll be interesting. But there are other quarterback deals that obviously we need to talk about. The first one, the one that kind of got the dominoes moving, was Geno Smith being traded to the Raiders. A massive deal. We had kind of like, it felt like there were rumors that the Seahawks, they denied them all in the combine, but Seahawks maybe were a little bit out on Geno Smith. The Raiders obviously have been linked pretty heavily to Shedeur Sanders and maybe making that quarterback pick. But as Rich said, we didn't know even where the Raiders are picking kind of who was going to be there. So it's an interesting move, for both sides. We'll get to Sam Darnold, that side of it. But just like looking at the surface level, no matter what you think of Geno Smith, and I'm not going to argue that Geno Smith is a elite quarterback, but ultimately Geno Smith is an upgrade for the Raiders, and they didn't have to pay that much to get him. And I have a tough time, Warren, saying a lot negative about this deal for the Raiders, because ultimately, like we talked about with Fields, they ended up with probably the best option that was available to them, and also an upgrade on what we saw from them last year.
I mean, Geno Smith has a negative perception, I think, league-wide among like casual fans that he's not a great quarterback. He obviously failed earlier in his career on a big stage in New York. So a lot of people probably remember that. A lot of people also look at Seattle and say, like, they're the far west team in the country, and they really haven't done a whole lot in the playoffs, and they haven't done much with Geno Smith. Like, I'm just talking surface level. So most average fans probably aren't having a very strong perception of Geno Smith, but we'll see when we do talk about Sam Darnold, like the offensive line and the pass protection that Seattle has not been able to give to Geno Smith. He's had to work around that. Obviously, he's had talent at the receiver position. When you talk about Lockett, yes, he has been getting a little bit older. You had DK Metcalf there. You had Jaxon, Smith-Njigba. So they did have some talent at the receiver position, but Geno Smith was asked to do a lot for that team and carry a lot of bags for that team to try to help them have some success. It speaks a lot to me, in my opinion, that you have a coach like a Pete Carroll who says, I want that guy, the guy that I had back there that played for me and not everybody else thought highly of him. I want him over here. That's different from some of these free agent moves where you have the coaching staff is still there and they're like, we don't really want this guy. And then another coach is like, well, I'll roll the dice on this guy. Let's see what he can do. Maybe he can bring some positives to me. Here you have the coach left. Well, not through his own decision, but he's now in Las Vegas and he wants his old quarterback. So to me, that speaks a little bit about what Pete Carroll believes that Geno Smith is going to bring to the table. And I'm excited for the upside that he will bring for the Raiders, because it is a better quarterback than they've seen in recent times. I mean, their best quarterback was the up and down years of Derek Carr, who obviously had some limitations there himself. So it's going to be interesting to see. They still have a lot of work to do for the Raiders, no doubt about it. But I agree with you, Ray. I think that was a good move for the Raiders.
And I think from a fantasy perspective, Rich, something people are going to get caught up on here, because the Raiders' best offensive player is Brock Bowers, even coming off, even as a rookie, he was their best offensive player. They obviously have Jacoby Myers. We kind of assume they're going to add a wide receiver. And so we'll kind of see kind of where this goes. But Brock Bowers is their best player. Geno Smith has not traditionally thrown a ton to the tight end. He's also thrown a lot short. I referenced in the article I wrote about Geno Smith, his accuracy statistics, which are great. His charted off-target throw rate is among the best in the NFL. But some of that could be explained because he didn't really push the ball down the field in Seattle. And again, there are mitigating circumstances there. The offensive line was bad. It was really bad. It didn't give him a lot of time. He was working with what was, available to him. And so I think there's going to be a lot of like this is who Geno Smith, these are his tendencies thing, to make cases about Jacoby Myers, make cases about Brock Bowers, make cases about the offense in general. But like, ultimately, maybe Geno Smith wasn't throwing to tight ends because he didn't have a tight end that he trusted to throw to, or because the Seahawks' best players were on the outside. And I think a lot of that really gets overblown. What's your kind of take on it? Like, are you worried at all about Brock Bowers because of Geno Smith's pass, or like, if Brock Bowers is the best player, the ball is going to find him? Or where do you kind of fall in that?
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, my early days of doing stuff with like coordinators and players, like the ball goes to the best players on the football field, like whether that be on a season total or like you reduce it to like a game sample or per play sample. And Brock Bowers is one of the best players, the best offensive player on the Raiders. Like, he's going to be targeted. We've had so many iterations of this type of story of like QB doesn't target this position. Well, yeah, because he didn't play with any good players at that position, or offensive coordinator didn't do this. Remember, it was a thing for Kyle Shanahan. He only throws the X receivers. He doesn't use a tight end. Well, guess what? He got George Kittle, and George Kittle started balling out. So I do think that Brock Bowers is going to lead the Raiders in targets. He's obviously the betting favorite. The Raiders are another one team just in a really, kind of tough spot. I mean, you want to field a competitive team. You're trying to win games. You hired a 73-year-old head coach. He's going to be 74 at the start of the season. You're trying to win games. So you get a 35-year-old quarterback. It's really harder for, I think, when you look at the Raiders side of this versus which I assume will go to the Seattle side and what they're doing because of just the AFC in general. I mean, if you're in the AFC and you're building a team that you want to be competitive, you have to prepare of building your team to beat two of Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow every season. As just the like, I have to get through at least two of these guys to make a Super Bowl. That's just the way the AFC landscape is in a given year. and you give up a 3rd round pick to do that, it is quite a lot for a 35-year-old quarterback. I think the Raiders will be competitive, but they're in a nightmare spot here. I mean, every team in their division made the playoffs last year. They also face the Eagles, the Commanders, and the Texans, who were playoff teams a year ago. The Bears and Colts could be on the come up. They've got other teams like, that are wild cards like Cleveland and Dallas, like who we don't believe are special teams, but are capable teams, especially in context of the Raiders. So this feels like an improvement, definitely objectively, to go to Geno Smith, but this feels like a complete 40-degree day in terms of construct of like what's going to happen with the Raiders as a franchise.
One more thing about this, and again, this is another thing we'll dig into. It'll definitely be part of the preview book. But, we have Chip Kelly there as offensive coordinator now. And I think people have this view of who Chip Kelly is based on obviously what we saw from him a long time ago. But that was 8 years ago, the last time we saw Chip Kelly. And what we saw from Chip Kelly last year at Ohio State was a lot different. Ohio State was actually near the bottom of the league in pass plays per game, in seconds per play under Chip Kelly. Not bottom of the league, bottom of the nation in that. He played faster and looked a little bit more like Chip Kelly at UCLA. We don't know what the Ryan Day influence is there. So there's lots of things going on. But yeah, there are lots of moving parts here in Las Vegas. And I'm interested to kind of see where this ends up and how Chip Kelly kind of decides to run this offense. The other side of it, though, go ahead.
I was just going to add that a lot of people had this perception of Chip Kelly that because he operated this like super up-tempo offense that he was just chucking the ball all over the place. That would not work with Pete Carroll, number one, and that also was not true about Chip Kelly's offense in terms of like having like the highest pass rate in the NFL. They ran an up-tempo offense, but they were really majoring in the run game and trying to create mismatches with that tempo. So this team is still going to lean more on the run game with Pete Carroll there and with Chip Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Pete Carroll side of it, I think is really important because we did actually see, if we're just kind of digging into this a little bit, we did see his final years there with the Seahawks, even the years with Geno. We saw them lean more into the pass. I believe in his last 3 years, they were 1 or 2% over pass rate expectation, which for a Pete Carroll team is like, that's basically being the Bengals for a Pete Carroll team. And so I do wonder with now that he's kind of back, he's with the Raiders, he's kind of, he's in his own domain. He really has control here. Are we going to lean back like full Pete Carroll? Is that where we're going? So that'll be interesting to watch. But with all of these Seahawks connections, we definitely have to go talk about the Seahawks. The rumor after the Geno Smith trade was that they were leaning in to Darnold. It does seem like Darnold maybe made them sweat a little bit and pushed up the price with some of the rumors we saw come out. But ultimately, Darnold does end up signing with the Seahawks. And I guess you kind of hinted at the offensive line in Seattle and why that might be a concern for Sam Darnold. And, that I think has to be the first, or at least the most important conversation we have is even coming off of the season, we know how it ended, but even coming off this season, which was very good for Sam Darnold, I think that specific concern, offensive line in Seattle, like that's the number one problem we have when we're trying to analyze this deal.
Yeah, like Geno Smith performed well under pressure. Geno Smith was pressured at the 3rd highest rate, number 30th in pressure rate allowed by the Seahawks offensive line last year. And Geno Smith's numbers under pressure, he was number 4 in completion rate, number 6 in accuracy, and number 9 in success rate. So Geno Smith was performing extremely well when he was under pressure for the Seattle Seahawks last year. Sam Darnold is going to be under pressure a lot more. And I recorded a video yesterday and posted it. But 29% of Sam Darnold's incompletions last year were because he was being pressured. That was the 5th highest rate of incompletions due to pressure in the NFL. And that was when he was playing behind the Minnesota Vikings offensive line, which ranked number 2 in pass block win rate. So this was a much better offensive line last year, and still he had the 5th highest rate of his incompletions due to pressure, with the Seahawks allowing the 3rd highest rate of pressure. We know quarterbacks control that a fair amount. It's going to be incumbent upon Sam Darnold to work with his offensive coordinator and get that ball out quickly. But the question is, who is he throwing it to? Because right now that depth chart is really lacking. You talk about bare cupboard behind JSN. mean, Jake Bobo is their number 2 or number 3 starting wide receiver right now. They're obviously going to go out there and make some other moves to try to replace that receiving core, but they lost a bunch of receivers. Their O-line doesn't provide a lot of protection, and is a very different situation than what Sam Darnold was playing behind and with last year in Minnesota, with a great receiving core, a number 2 ranked pass block win rate offensive line. So they're going to need to be adjustments made, or Sam Darnold's going to have to just outperform his historical numbers of performance under pressure, or the more likely scenario is the third door, which is that Sam Darnold is going to have a higher incompletion rate overall. He's going to have a lower completion rate because he's going to find himself under more pressure, and he's going to be throwing more errant passes.
How dare you disrespect Jake Bobo like this? I can't imagine.
I actually think the opposite of this is going to happen, though.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because of Clint Kubiak and that system and how they've mitigated, poor offensive line play that throughout all iterations of where this coaching staff has gone. I mean, you look at what Kyle Shanahan's done in San Francisco, largely what Mike McDaniel's done in Miami with just really bad offensive line play. We saw it with Clint Kubiak at the start of last year with New Orleans. And you look at what Seattle did offensively last year, a lot of the pressures that Geno Smith faced, there was an offensive line talent, but Ryan Grubb, there's a reason he was one and done. He did absolutely nothing creative to mask the deficiencies that they had. They were 26th in pre-snap motion rate. They were 28th in play action rate. And say what you want about Derek Carr as a quarterback, but under Clint Kubiak, he was 5th in pre-snap motion rate, 11th in play action rate, and he was hyper efficient. He was 11th in EPA per dropback, 10th in yards per pass attempt, and Darnold was good in all of those components. Now you get younger at the quarterback position, you pick up a 3rd-round pick, and you get a quarterback that stylistically fits your scheme that you want to run better. I think that top down, Seattle's taking a lot of heat, but I think they won this whole set of transactions.
Ultimately, I think it worked out for both. I don't really have a negative view of this for either.
I mean, Darnold's going to regress regardless because he had a career year of an outlier season. He's not going to have the touchdown rate he had. He's going to regress, and people will probably point to some of that other stuff. But I think stylistically, he's the type of quarterback that Clint Kubiak wants in his offense.
Yeah, and I think with Clint Kubiak, I think a lot about, they're not from the same tree, obviously. We're talking like Shanahan and McVay, but you would expect him to be very interested in doing the same things that Kevin O'Connell was doing, to get Darnold where close to where he was last year. We saw Darnold have a lot of success with play action last year. You would expect we're going to see a lot of that from Clint Kubiak. And so, I think ultimately the pressure thing, I do think is a concern, but they can mitigate it. And I think, you mentioned we've seen the McVay tree do this. We see what Mike McDaniel has done in Miami for Tua, and that obviously lives large in your head as well. And so if they're able to do that and get Darnold, kind of moving the same way and keep Darnold healthy, it could work out. I do think, though, I want to ask from a fantasy perspective, have you thought about where we're moving JSN? Because I think that, it's pretty clear they'll add somebody else. I want to see Sam Howell throwing to Jake Bobo in week 16 for DFS, because I think that would be a wonderful outcome. But I assume that we are going to see another receiver added. But from what we saw with JSN at the end of last year, the kind of step he took forward in year 2, we assume he's going to be the number 1 option here. Have you thought about where are we putting him? How high are we moving JSN in kind of seasonal leagues? Have you thought about that?
No, because just there's so much still to be said, and that's kind of been the story of this free agency. The moves that have gone on. We haven't had a Saquon or a Derrick Henry change teams to where exactly the role and where he's going to be on that depth chart. We've got a lot of guys moving chairs, but in a lot of unstable situations still. We know Seattle's going to continue to add guys. Seattle would be a great spot for Matthew Golden, especially with Kubiak, especially pair at JSN. He would be a real good fit there, I believe. And you look at guys like Najee Harris moving. It's we know they're not done. The same thing if you want to have instant reaction on Jaylen Warren, we know they're not done. There's still just all these things in limbo in all these spots. We have very few defined depth charts and moves to kind of address. Even the DK Metcalf and George Pickens, we don't even know who the quarterback is yet. We're still waiting to see who Pittsburgh's going to get to be their quarterback. So with JSN, you love the way he finished last season. Obviously, there's a system change. I think one that's actually going to be upgraded for the reasons that I talked about, but we still want to see where the depth chart is. I think they're going to be a run first team too, as opposed to last year, right, where they were more of a higher drop back team. So I'm waiting to kind of let some things kind of settle in still and kind of see where depth charts are. It's still only March 11th. That we haven't even, the season hasn't even officially started yet. It starts tomorrow.
Well, I will say to Rich's point. So I was proposing 3 doors, and Rich thinks that it's going to be door number 1, which is the offensive coordinator is going to come in and help mitigate a lot of those problems. And we did see Derek Carr look great for those 2 weeks, right? Those first 2 weeks of the season last year with Clint Kubiak, he looked great. And then the Philadelphia Eagles and Vic Fangio stacked that offensive line, or stacked the offensive line with defenders. They kept bringing down a 5th man to a 5-man.
Well, they just had
line.
Injuries. The Saints just got
eventually
they
did. Eventually they did. They lost all their wide receivers with injury, but
and their offensive line,
offense,
they lost 3 starting linemen too.
That's true. But that offense started heading downhill like right just after 2 weeks. Like we thought this offense was just going to be berserk with Clint Kubiak after they beat Dallas. And looking back on those 2 games, they beat the Carolina Panthers 47-10, and then they beat the Dallas Cowboys 44-19. Dallas and Carolina were horrific last season. But yeah, look, Clint Kubiak, obviously change of pace, different situation for that offense in general without Ryan Grubb there. And I 100% agree. We're going to see a lower pass rate with this offense and the weapons and who they've got out there. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform. And, they're in a division right now where I think the Rams are the clear class of this division right now. When you look at what's happened in San Francisco, historically it's been like San Francisco and the Rams and Seattle up in that. But right now it's just the Rams. I think San Francisco is taking a step back a little bit. It looks like the Cardinals still are kind of in limbo, I think. And so there is opportunity for the Seattle Seahawks, even if they are fumbling around a little bit this year, to kind of figure it out and have some success in that division. But I do think, to your point, largely that Sam Darnold does regress this year because he's just not going to perform like he did in a career year last season.
When I look at a lot of my favorite signings, they all appear to be former 49ers, which seems like that seems like a bad thing for 49ers, the 49ers, but we'll obviously dig more into that.
They still got a
Rich
lot
will
of
have to hear
talent though, so like even writing them
Fair.
off is probably premature, because when you look at the names that they lost, like not a lot of the guys that they lost were hyper contributors to their roster last year. Charvarius Ward missed the whole middle of the season. Dre Greenlaw barely played. Hufunga missed the start of the season. Like these guys weren't like primary contributors. Aaron Banks was like the lone guy that they lost. That was like a major contributor to their what they were doing, and then Deebo Samuel in the trade. But they've got a lot of still front end talent. If you get Christian McCaffrey back, you have a healthy Trent Williams, like still even at his age is one of the best left tackles in the game. And we know why they're moving these dominoes. They have to set up the Brock Purdy contract. It's the same thing when we talk about the Houston Texans and the Tunsil trade. Like you see what's coming down the pipeline, and they're trying to get ahead of that. And these players that largely, like I said, weren't even really on the field for them last year, were the guys that were part of the chopping block in terms of setting that up. But they've got a lot of talent still on that roster. I wouldn't write them off, but I do agree that the Rams are the clear favorite in the division.
But you can't have like both sides of that argument. You can't have saying that they're coming off a down year because they had a lot of injuries, and then saying, well, those players were injured, so it doesn't really matter moving forward. They had a down year because those guys, in part, because those guys weren't on the field, right? And so now they're just not going to be on the field at all moving forward. And ultimately, like them not having Ward makes them a worse team. Them not having a healthy version, and we're hoping we get a healthy version.
But we don't know who they're going to have yet. It's the same thing when we get to the
Fair
Texans
enough.
offensive line. It's March 11th. Like us acting like it's doom and gloom for CJ Stroud. Like we don't even know who they're going to put on the field yet.
Yeah, I mean, that is fair. But like we're analyzing what the roster looks like now. And I think that saying, well, they didn't play a lot for him last year is disingenuous, because
I'm asking us to be better. I'm asking fantasy analysts and fantasy analysis to be better. Don't accept like, hey, we don't have to have like an instant hot take. Like it's March 11th. The roster's not set yet.
Yeah, but I don't think that analysis is better, because you're saying if your argument for the 49ers last year is, well, they had a lot of injuries and that's why they struggled. And then
that's not why they struggled. I'm saying the guys that they let go weren't contributors to their roster.
But they were the year before when they were better. When
Yeah.
they went to the Super Bowl. They were contributors.
Yeah, but they
And
still
so-
have.
I think
You're talking
the-
about like players at the positions. They still have arguably the best left tackle in the game. They have arguably the best running back in the game. Still, they have a quarterback that, through all those injuries last year, played great football. Like Brock Purdy last year proved that he warrants the contract he's going to get. Like Brock Purdy stepped up and played phenomenal football last year with everything deteriorating around him. I mean, so I still look at the 49ers. I still expect them to actually probably perform a little better than they did last year. And who knows, they could outright be better. They could improve in areas too. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily doom and gloom for the 49ers.
Yeah, and I don't want it to seem like I think the 49ers are dead in the water, because I don't, because they've got a good coaching staff, and their offense even last year was good, even with the issues that they had, and they can reload on defense. I don't want to make it seem like that, but it does matter that they lost Charvarius Ward because he's a good player, and it does matter that they lost Dre Greenlaw because when he's healthy, he's a good player. Hufanga, that when healthy part is a lot trickier, but he's a good player as well. It does matter. Like it's not that it just doesn't matter.
I'm not
it's
saying it doesn't matter. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the price of success. Like when you're a good NFL
Yeah.
organization, you lose good players. You know, I mean, the Eagles have lost good players throughout this whole thing, and Howie Roseman is great at great at reshuffling the deck. The best thing you can do in free agency is like buy value positions, and that's what like Howie's done. Like buying running backs, buying off-ball linebackers, buying safeties. Like that's where the Eagles have made their bread and butter in free agency, like consistently. I mean, look at Zach Bond, like we're able to sign him and what he turned out for them. And then he gets a long-term contract. And so like, yeah, I still think the 49ers can definitely they lost an off-ball linebacker. Like Dre Greenlaw's a great player, but they're going to be able to replace that. They lost an interior offensive lineman. You can replace that. Like these are not high value positions. They lost a fullback. Like they still have high equity players at high equity positions.
How dare you call Kyle Juszczyk a fullback? But to your point, we have a lot left to figure out. Like we still have no idea who's going to play quarterback for the Steelers, for the Giants.
They did sign Luke Farrell, Ray. So
yes,
remember.
I forgot about the $20 million Luke Farrell deal. So we have a lot of questions. I don't really want to spend a ton of time on it. It seems like Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers are going to end up. One of them will end up with the Steelers and one of them will end up with the Giants. That's what it kind of seems like to me. Is that what y'all are seeing as well?
It certainly looks like that's where the dots are being connected, and both of those teams don't have a starting quarterback. So they're going to have to head in that direction because they also don't have the draft capital. And what's shocking the New York Giants are picking number 3, and we could talk if we want to. I'll save the deep dive, but the New York Giants gave sort of a vote of confidence to Brian Daboll after the team won a game late in the season that basically cost them the number 1 overall pick. So that ownership group in general, in my opinion, in New York is just moronic. They could have had the number 1 pick in this draft and taken whatever quarterback that they wanted to. Now they're not sure what they're going to end up getting, or if they do try to move up in the draft to get one of the top quarterbacks, they're going to have to give up a bunch that they would not have had to give up had they just lost the games. They were sitting there a few weeks left in the season at the number 1 draft pick. If they just kept losing, they would have had the number 1 draft pick. And instead they win 1 game. It just made no sense at all from an ownership perspective. And then you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers, the same exact type of situation there with regard to ownership. The difference is that they have a better core of players, and so they don't lose as many games as the New York Giants do. But the Pittsburgh Steelers are not going to get over the hump with the moves that they've been making. And the fact that this is the situation they find themselves in is really not all that shocking to me. We said last year at this exact same time, once they got the cheap deal for Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, I think both were like $3 million or less that the Steelers were paying for each of them last year. We said one of these 2 guys is going to win the battle, but nobody's really winning this thing because it's going to hurt the Steelers' performance in 2024 because neither of these quarterbacks are actually that great to actually win them games that matter the most, which is playoff games. They ended up winning a couple games more than I thought that they would last year from a win-loss over-under perspective, but they still ended up the same place that we thought, which is not doing anything in the postseason. And, the Pittsburgh Steelers, they go out and they have these 2 I mean, Rich will be able to opine more on this, you two as well, Ray, in terms of where you would rank George Pickens and DK Metcalf from a fantasy perspective, but two talented receivers, contested catch guys that are physical and big on the outside, but are absolute head cases if they're not getting the football enough. And you don't know who your quarterback is going to be. And Aaron Rodgers, like, I could just see both of these guys. If Aaron Rodgers does end up in Pittsburgh, I could see after a couple of weeks, the stories come out. I'm joking a little bit here, but Aaron Rodgers potentially wanting to retire. He's got DK Metcalf and George Pickens running the wrong routes. He's not throwing the football accurately enough down the field to them. This thing could absolutely blow up if we want to take like the far kind of crazy thought process that Rodgers winds up in Pittsburgh and this thing goes absolutely sideways. But it's not surprising to me that the Pittsburgh Steelers find themselves here. They just did not do any of their work to prepare a succession plan for Ben Roethlisberger when he was going to retire. I want to say from 2018 through 2024, they had one quarterback that they selected in 6 drafts within the first 6 rounds, and that was Kenny Pickett. And you knew that Ben Roethlisberger was going to be leaving. So a disaster there doesn't surprise me. And I'm interested to see which one does end up in Pittsburgh. I think the better quarterback obviously is Aaron Rodgers, but I just don't know what we're going to get out of him working behind that with that offense and that offensive line and that coaching staff.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, hopefully we have an idea about this when we record on Thursday, Rich, because we just don't know. And like, to your point, we have no idea what to think of Metcalf and Pickens. We don't know if George Pickens will be there. I would assume that that's the case and that's their plan, but we'll have to see where that goes. You mentioned the offensive line situation in Houston, and I do want to talk about that a little bit, not from like a doom and gloom perspective.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have to add, some people, and like getting rid of Kenyon Green, like, that's fine. Shaq Mason was okay. He wasn't great last year. The Laremy Tunsil side of it is interesting because Warren, you have a lot of stats on this about how good Tunsil has been, and they didn't want to pay him. They talk about how they like wanted a culture change or whatever. But I think that from the Commanders side of it, it's interesting because the Commanders are doing right now exactly what the Texans did last year in taking advantage of this window they have with a very good sophomore quarterback. And it didn't work out great for the Texans last year. They kind of ended up, I would say even though they got to the same round of the playoffs, they were probably a worse team than they were the year before. And we'll see how it works out here for the Commanders. But ultimately, like, to me, the Commanders are doing what they're supposed to do to try to build around this contract. And for the Texans, they're going to find guys, and you want to change the offensive line because the offensive line wasn't good. But to me, Warren, you traded the one good guy, and I just don't know if that's really the right approach here, or even who they're going to end up with on the other side of this.
Yeah, if we're talking Laremy Tunsil, you look back at the last 3 seasons, this guy ranked top 4 every single year in pressure rate allowed among left tackles with the requisite number of pass block attempts. If you look back at the last 3 years combined, sum them up, and again, look at the requisite left tackles and pass block attempts, he ranked number 2 in pressure rate allowed, behind only Tristan Wirfs of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who's a perennial Pro Bowler, one of the best left tackles in the NFL. Now, it's hilarious to me that the Houston Texans fan base, to try to cope, are and say, well, this guy committed a lot of false starts, just look at all the penalties. Like, okay, it is something that he needs to work on, but he's still, at the same time, been one of the best left tackles in the NFL over the last 3 years. This is going to put the Houston Texans, they also got rid of, I saw earlier today, they got rid of another, their center, and this team is rebuilding, reshaping that offensive line. And we did see CJ Stroud take a big step backwards last year in his efficiency compared to what he was delivering back in 2023. So there are massive questions to be answered along that offensive line from a protection standpoint for CJ Stroud entering the 2025 season. But for the Washington Commanders, certainly it's never a bad thing landing one of the best left tackles. They still keep, I think, their first 2 picks in the 2025 NFL draft. And they're basically setting up Jayden Daniels for success. Jayden Daniels, they're going to let him hopefully have a little bit more time in the pocket. He had one of the highest scramble rates in the NFL. Now, we all know that from an efficiency perspective, like, what is the best play? It's a pass play where the quarterback ends up keeping the ball and scrambling because of an open run lane. That is the highest floor play of any in the NFL. but you do want to limit the downfield hits on your quarterback. So you don't want him taking off quite as much. So you would like to have a little bit better protection there on his blind side. And so that's what Laremy Tunsil provides. It's not the exact same, but you saw Adam Peters make a move to bring in Trent Williams to help the San Francisco 49ers. Actually, ironically enough, got him out of Washington when there was some dissatisfaction with Trent Williams and Daniel Snyder and the ownership there. So Adam Peters in part helps land Trent Williams to be the left tackle for years out in San Francisco. And now he makes the move to land a new left tackle for hopefully what they're expecting to be years in Washington with Laremy Tunsil.
And Rich, we haven't actually talked, I don't think, since the Deebo Samuel trade. And so I don't know kind of where you stand on that, how any strong feelings about this move for him.
Yeah, I mean, we could get into it probably more on the fantasy show, but I mean, all the moves for Washington have made sense, and this move I think this is a win-win move for both teams, right? Like it makes sense. I mean, probably not a win-win move for the Texans in terms of what they're going to replace Tunsil with in terms of left tackle, but he had only 1 year remaining on his contract. He wasn't going to be a guy that they probably were going to fit in when you're talking about the price of success. When you draft Derek Stingley, when you draft Will Anderson, when you draft CJ Stroud, all back to back to back, and you have to start extending these guys, who are you going to extend? Who ends up being the outside guy? And it was all pointing towards Tunsil being the outside guy going into age 31 season. So you get a second round pick for him and an extra couple futures for him. It does make sense to clear that space. Now, what are they going to replace him with remains to be seen. But, they definitely are going to prioritize giving Stroud that next $150 million contract. Will Anderson's going to get a super contract, and so is Stingley at high leverage positions. So that just comes with the territory. And it's fun to see the Commanders actually doing, anti-Dan Snyder things, right? Like the Commanders had it down so bad for so long, and Washington football fans, they make their NFC title game for the first time in 30 years. And, Magic and his team are doing what they're doing for the Dodgers. And everyone hates the Dodgers in baseball because they don't have any restrictions because of what they could do, but they're kind of doing the same thing. They're trying to load up on guys. The one thing with the Commanders that is kind of the one area that is a little bit sketchy is their offense is really old outside of Jaden Daniels and Tunsil included, post 30-year-old players everywhere. Because people forget McLaurin is actually older than Deebo. He was an older prospect, but coming into the NFL, he's a 24-year-old rookie. So everyone that's a core contributor outside of Jaden Daniels is really, really old in that offense. That's the one kind of red flag, but it's fun to see the Commanders progressing and trying to build on the success that they had last year. But definite win-win, I think. I think it makes sense on the Texans side. The bar for the Texans to clear and having a better offensive line, even with the removal of Laremy Tunsil, is extremely low.
Yeah, but I mean, you're still losing Laremy Tunsil. We'll see what happens. Like you said, this is one of them where I really agree with you. We have to see where this ends up with the Texans. And we also have seen offensive line.
They did sign Laken Tomlinson while we were on, who probably is better than Kenyon Green.
There's not a probably in that. So there we are. I do want to hit on. We haven't. We like the evil sports talkers that we are. We've only talked about quarterbacks for an hour, and so we haven't talked about any of the other positions. But I do want to talk about an interesting team here because I think what the Bears are doing is very interesting. How they kind of approach this early period. Obviously, trading for Tooney, training for Jaxon, signing Drew Dahlman. Then they add on the defensive side, they add a pass rusher. They add Grady Jarrett, which is all of that is really interesting. And I think I like what they're doing with some caveats about. I don't actually know how good Grady Jarrett is at this point in his career. We haven't really seen from Dio. We haven't really seen that season we want to see from them. But ultimately, I think in theory, Warren, what the Bears are trying to do is very good, and I've been pretty happy with what we've seen from them.
Yeah, what I like, and we've seen a number of teams do it. We'll talk in a moment about the Patriots, but teams that have the cap space because they've got a quarterback on his rookie deal, you don't have much time to work with. And then you bring in a new head coach like the Chicago Bears did. They want to implement that strategy very quickly. And so I think it's perfect that the Bears have been aggressive in this free agency period. We know that you tend to overspend a little bit in free agency, but when you're in those situations with an elevated cap and you've got the cap space thanks to a quarterback on a rookie deal, and you got a new head coach, this is the time to go after it. And the Chicago Bears went ahead and did that, replaced their guard, center, and guard, all three, the middle of that offensive line. And they needed to do that massively for several reasons. Number one is obviously the pass protection for Caleb Williams, who was sacked a ton, pressured a ton last season. We know that the quarterback does control that to some extent, but they need to figure out a way to get him a little bit more comfortable with the passing game to execute from a more timing-based perspective. And so allowing him to be a little bit settled there with some of that better pass protection in the middle is going to benefit Caleb Williams massively. And then what else will benefit Caleb Williams is having a bit better of a run game. And if you look at the Chicago Bears last year, up the middle of the field, from the guards, guard, center, guard, any run to that direction of the football field, this team ranked 30th in yards per carry last season from the running backs, gaining only 3.1 yards per carry. They ranked 30th in EPA per rush attempt. They ranked 29th in success rate and 30th in explosive run rate, with just a 3% explosive run rate for any running back going up the middle of the field beyond just running to the tackle. So replacing those three players in one round of free agency is the way to overhaul that offensive line. And certainly I like the vision that the Chicago Bears are operating with and the aggressiveness with which they're pursuing their plan, which is we need to build through the trenches and we need to figure out a way to get this passing and rushing attack to function at a much higher level than they were last season.
From a fantasy perspective, we obviously don't know where the running back situation is going to end up, but with these upgrades, the Bears stick out to me. We have so many good rookie running backs coming out. We're actually going to publish Rich's profiles on the top rookie running backs, which are exceptional. You should read the quarterbacks, tight ends are already out. Go and read them. Sharpfootballanalysis.com. They're wonderful. And we just have a ton of running backs that could contribute in week one. And the Bears stick out to me as a place where I would really like one of those rookies to end up. They obviously still have DeAndre Swift. They have Roschon Johnson, but like in this offense now with Ben Johnson at the helm, this is a spot, now that they're upgrading the offensive line, this is a spot where I would really like to see one of those rookies, end up. And I don't know if that's like a popular opinion to have, but I think it would be really interesting. Kind of, what are you looking at there, Rich?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have flirted with the idea of even Javonte being on the board for them at 10. Given what, Ben Johnson comes from, using two backs, in Detroit, them spending a lot of capital on running backs, not just Jahmyr Gibbs, but signing David Montgomery in free agency, having multiple, quality backs. It's ironic that he's getting DeAndre Swift again, a guy that he had, and then they kind of ushered out a little bit and then replaced him with Jahmyr Gibbs. But they're definitely drawing live. I definitely think they're going to take some type of power back, whether that be, at pick 10, reaching in on Javonte, or looking at, with their subsequent picks, getting a guy like Caleb Johnson or something to kind of fit in there. The Bears also their offensive line just wasn't healthy last year. They had one offensive lineman appear in every game last year. It was Coleman Shelton. Their most frequently used offensive line combination was on the field for just 34% of their snaps. They were 31st in EPA loss per sacks. Now, some of that is Caleb's fault. His pressure to sack rate, a problem that was in college, was second to last in the NFL again as a rookie. Only Will Levis was worse. They've still got some things to kind of address here. We've seen some teams try to do this. Remember, the Chargers tried to do this with Justin Herbert, buy an offensive line, and it didn't fully work out for them. So we have to see if these guys can stay healthy. Tooney's a little bit older, but has been an all-pro the past 2 years. Jonah Jackson hasn't played a full season since 2021. So they still have to, I still think they're not done. I think they're going to draft rookies to this offensive line still too. But everything that the Bears are doing is another arrow. Give your quarterback, your rookie quarterback stuff. And Warren's going to talk about the Patriots. I think the Patriots are doing the exact opposite of what they should be doing.
Interesting. I was going to ask.
You're not giving Drake May anything right now. And the defensive players that you're signing are guys that are typical overpays that we see mistakes be made every year in free agency. Harold Landry was dead last in the NFL in pass rush win rate for edge defenders. Milton Williams is a guy you're excited about, but then you're paying for a career year for a player that had 3 years of really no production beforehand, and you're paying a premium on it.
His career pressure rate in the first 3 years was half of what his pressure rate was.
So if you get that player, that's great. Yeah. But what if you get the other guy? We've seen what happened with Javon Hargrave when he left the Eagles, and you move him from that infrastructure. So those types of free agents.
Eagles signed one last year. The Eagles signed Bryce Hall,
Yeah.
who was inactive. And I brought it up actually on this exact episode of free agency. And I was trying not to be negative, but I was like, are we sure that this is working out? And then Hassan Reddick just, sat out the most of the year for the Jets, and, it is what it is. Now he plays in Tampa Bay. But yeah, like, we've seen this exact thing, that this spike in pressure rate. We've seen this exact thing happen, and maybe it works out. Maybe Milton Williams, maybe this was just the beginning of him turning around. But to your point, Robert Spillane doesn't really fit that. Carlton Davis doesn't really fit that, although he struggles to stay on the field. But to your point, like, are we maybe overpaying these guys a little bit and then just not getting the things that we need outside of Morgan Moses? That's probably going to work out.
We got Matt
but
Collins,
like, are we not getting the things we need? Hey, make sure that he doesn't have to wear cleats on the field. Like, petition the NFL, he doesn't have to wear shoes on the field. We're going to get the best version of Matt Collins. But I think you might be on the other side of this, Warren, that you kind of like what the Patriots are doing here.
Well, I find it good that they're spending because they need to spend, but they're building in Mike Vrabel's image. And you could tell a defensive head coach has come in the building that the organization completely loves. And he's saying, it's like a husband and wife are trying to cook a meal, and each are responsible for one thing. And Mike Vrabel just bought the really good groceries for like the thing he's preparing, and the rest of the meal is going to be crappy because they don't have anything good on that side of the ball. I'm not suggesting that it's absolutely going to be a disaster, but to Rich's point, Milton, they've spent more money in free agency than any other team has by far. Right now, I believe they've given out $277 million in contract value. There's only one other team that's above $180 million. And the New England Patriots, of that contract value, it's Milton Williams defense, Carlton Davis defense, Harold Landry defense, Robert Spillane defense. Those are the three guys that they gave deals to that were in excess of $25 million. The next closest guy was Morgan Moses. They signed along the offensive line there from the New York Jets, 3 years, $24 million. But nobody is hitting for an excess of $10 million per year other than those top four guys. And they're all on the defensive side of the ball, to Rich's point. So, it's clear that they're building in the image of Mike Vrabel. It's clear that he got from ownership and the general manager what he wanted, which is he wants to remake this defense to do the things that he thinks are going to help them win games on that side of the football. But it is a little sad. Now, it's not as if there are all these luxury offensive weapons that have been signed over the course of free agency that, they missed out on all these guys because they're just a plethora of great talent on the offensive side of the football. But some of these other teams, if you look at like the Minnesota Vikings, helping their young quarterback by signing a couple new offensive linemen. You look at some of these other teams around the league that do have the rookie quarterback, like the Chicago Bears, who signed, as we just discussed, 3 new offensive linemen. The New England Patriots did not make moves that aggressively day one in free agency to go after players to help to help Drake May on that side of the football.
First of all, it's Bryce Huff and not Hall, and I heard it myself say it. I apologize, Bryce. I hope things go better in your second season with the Eagles. But the other part of that is we're kind of doing what Rich talked about with the 49ers last year, though. Just a little bit ago. So what the Patriots have done, this free agent class did not have a ton of offensive weapons that you would be interested in. And then once T. Higgins was off the board and Chris Godwin was off the board, it seems like they tried to give a lot of money to Chris Godwin. Once Chris Godwin's off the board, that's not there. And so they spent a lot of money on defense, but we still have the draft coming up. We would suspect that they're going to end up with, one of the top offensive linemen early on. There's some wide receivers they can target later. We know there's running backs they can target later if they want to do that as well. So the story's not written here. The fact that they've spent money on defense is they're leaning into the strength of this class. Now, did they overspend for Landry and Williams? And, maybe I like Robert Spillane. I don't think they did. Carlton Davis. Like, did they do that? Maybe, but like, there's still an opportunity here for them to build in areas of the draft that I think from reading people that follow the draft much more closely than I am. So I'm not saying I have like insider knowledge on this, but I think areas of the draft that that people generally like are the things that they need. And so if this is their plan, if this is how they approach the draft, then I think that this will make a lot more sense, moving forward. But again, if they're leaning defense heavy in the draft, then I think we would have to ask a lot more of these questions again.
Oh no, they're definitely taking a tackle at 4.
They have to, right? Like that has to be where we end up. All right. Anything else kind of interesting? Anything strike you from this first big day of free agency, Rich? Anything that really moves the needle for you?
Nothing crazy, like I said, especially from like my area where I'm taking it. Like I said, I definitely think a lot of this stuff gets like overreacted to as like the significance and the insignificance to the degree. But I understand we need things to talk about. I am curious about this Josh Palmer signing though, for sure. It's very
It's top of the list for Thursday for you and I, because I
it's
don't
very well. Maybe we'll
what's
save
happening.
it for Thursday then. But I do think it is very interesting. I think he went to like one of the spots where he actually might be the best receiver on the roster.
First of all, Khalil Shakir is still the best receiver.
But Khalil Shakir is a niche player.
Yeah, sure, that's fair. But like Palmer, and again, we'll get to it more on Thursday. Palmer has only ever gotten targets whenever he's absolutely had to be the guy to get targets.
Yeah, and that's the thing, does it just fall into this rotation where the Bills are just playing everybody?
Do we do what we did last year, right? Like, is that where we are? Palmer's not a replacement for Mac Hollins because first of all, no human is a replacement for Mac Hollins because he's the GOAT. But also like he's not just going to be downfield like blocking, doing all that stuff. But like, do we end up in this same exact situation where Shakir's the only guy that really has that role, and maybe Kincaid? I don't know, but the sticker shock of seeing how much Palmer got and how much Darius Slayton got, who's a player I really do like. I think Darius Slayton is one of the more underrated receivers in the league, but he's still at best the number 2 passing option. He wasn't even that last year. Wan'Dale Robinson was in New York, and you see some of the money these receivers are getting, and there's a bit of sticker shock that
I mean, once Tutu Atwell, they kept him at the 10 mil, it set everything in motion. That's then immediately someone traded for Christian Kirk and was like, that 15 mil, that looks all right for one season.
Rich, what do you think about Javonte in Dallas? I know I don't want to steal any more topics from your Thursday show.
Absolutely zero thoughts. There's another place in the multiverse where his knee stayed intact. Maybe you're hoping for like a J.K. Dobbins bounce back a year removed, but it's just a bummer that the injury kind of sapped his tackle breaking ability that he had early on in his career these last 2 years.
You don't think it's absolutely not going to play into whether or not they draft a running back early?
Oh no, he only got a 1 year. Even the Najee stuff. That's why I didn't even put a full article out on Najee, just because it's the fact that he only got a 1 year contract, and now even a day later the money was lower than we thought. There's just still so much to be written on the situation. It's still just so nebulous.
What about you, Warren? Anything sticking out to you?
No, I mean, I think we covered most of it. We definitely Javonte was a guy we were fading late in the season. We're taking his longest rush under. I remember on props like left and right down the stretch, and we were betting the over on Jaleel McLaughlin with frequency as well at varying points to close out the season. So I don't think the Cowboys certainly are not going to be getting, to Rich's point, like a guy that is a decent running back. Those days are behind him, and they're going to need to continue their plan moving forward. But he's definitely not a plus in that offense behind that line. And keep in mind, I mean, the Denver offensive line was much better than what Dallas has from a run blocking perspective at the moment. So I think we covered most things. I remember our conversations on last Wednesday or Thursday, as well as Sunday. Like, this free agent class, just not a whole lot of bang there, and it was a little bit more defensive focused. And actually, if I go and look at the amount of money that's being spent by position here, cornerback has signed for, there's been 15 corners that have signed for $445 million combined, and defensive tackles and defensive ends are the next two positions, $311 million and $298 million each. After that, that's when you drop all the way down to like less than $250 million has been spent on guards and $175 million on quarterbacks so far. So it was definitely a defensive focused period in free agency. The elite players, whatever they were on the defensive side of the ball for the most part. And just to the overarching sentiment that generally speaking, you end up overspending in free agency on some of these players. So if your team hasn't made a ton of moves, unless you're the Dallas Cowboys, you shouldn't really like get too overly concerned with the fact that your team hasn't made a lot of moves, because I know that's a very common practice in free agency for everybody to get upset when their teams aren't spending a lot of money in free agency. So the teams that haven't spent money in free agency thus far: Cleveland Browns, Pittsburgh Steelers, Atlanta Falcons, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Dallas Cowboys. Those are the 5 teams that have spent the least amount to date in free agency. So obviously the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to need to be getting a quarterback here momentarily, but the rest of those teams, they have not spent very much in free agency, but it's not the end of the world if you're not spending a lot.
First of all, the Browns made, I think, my favorite trade in NFL history, trading for Super Bowl champion Kenneth Pickett III and sending Dorian Thompson-Robinson back. Like, could you imagine, the Eagles, like, they were like, we can't do this deal without Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I don't even understand. I don't understand how that deal happens. I love that deal. I also, because it worked out so well for me last year being a Broncos supporter, I want to keep the Broncos bit going by saying, getting Hufanga and Greenlaw at, I think, relative discounts, although we saw what Holland got from the Giants. So maybe Hufanga is not at a discount, obviously has the injury issues, but I thought that was pretty good for them. And then for the Lions, they lose Carlton Davis, but then they get DJ Reed for less than what Carlton Davis ended up getting from the Patriots. We know Davis has issues staying healthy. He is a good player, but I don't even think he's a better player than Reed. I think the Lions might have upgraded for less money, which is really good for them. And so I really like that move from the Lions. Those kind of stick out to me, but ultimately I just hope we see some Kenny Pickett starts in Cleveland. I can't wait for Super
against
Bowl
the Steelers.
Kenny Pickett
against the Steelers.
Hey, Myles Garrett and Kenny Pickett now teammates.
Think about, I do like Myles Garrett was like, there is no way I will sign back here. They go, what if we gave you $40 million per year? And he said, there's a chance that I will in fact sign back here, which, no hate, Myles. If someone wanted to do that for me, Warren, I'd be out the door. And if someone offers me $40 million a year, Warren, I'm gone. I just want you to know that.
Understood.
Listen, if you're a Cowboys fan, that also hurt your soul, because Max Crosby and Myles Garrett getting those contracts when Micah Parsons is next in line.
Right. I don't know what
Cowboys,
Jerry Jones is doing in general.
The Cowboys and Bengals have a rich tradition of not taking advantage of where the market is. Like, do they think that it's going to go down? Like, did they see the salary cap increase and go, you know what? I bet it gets cheaper to re-sign Micah Parsons. I bet it gets cheaper to re-sign T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. It just doesn't make sense kind of where we are. The Bengals, Trey Hendrickson, we still have that to happen a lot left to happen, as Rich said.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a lot of fun, and keep in mind, guys, on Thursday at, I believe, noon Eastern, right, Ray? Is that the time?
That's right.
Noon Eastern. Ray and Rich are going to go live, break it down even more transactions from a fantasy perspective as it relates to free agency. In the next 48 hours, a lot more of these dominoes are going to fall on that side of the football. Rich, also, if you're a little bit bored, it's a slow day right now with free agency. Yesterday was crazy. Sunday night was ridiculous. That was an assault to have that many transactions occur. The day that we get an hour of sleep stolen by the government was ridiculous. And then yesterday was crazy because X was down and we weren't sure when it was going to come back. But now today's been a lot slower. If you're getting a little bored on the free agency streets, Rich has been writing up player analysis for all of the rookie class. We've got all the quarterbacks published on the website. We've got all of the tight ends published on the website. I believe, is it wide receivers up next, Ray?
Well, running backs are up next. Wide receivers.
Okay.
I believe you said you wrote 4,700 words yesterday about wide receivers and got through 6 of them. Is that what you said, Rich?
It's going great.
Can't wait.
So we've got running backs up next, and that's going to go on the website soon. You can read Rich's information and analysis on all of these guys, what their college production looked like, how they are forecasting for NFL potential upside. And then he's going to hit the wide receivers as well. So all of that's going to be up at sharpfootballanalysis.com. So a reminder, subscribe over on YouTube, Sharp Football Analysis. Give this a thumbs up. Hit that alert button as well. Make sure that you're on our mailing list, because we're going to continue to connect with you guys that way. So go to sharp.football and you can subscribe to the free mailing list. Now more than ever, I think if yesterday showed you anything, it's that you need to make sure that you're connected to people that you trust and enjoy their information in as many ways as possible, in case one platform has some problems. And as a result, make sure you're on YouTube, make sure you're on our mailing list as well. And we're going to give you tons of information and analysis, as always, up on the website, sharpfootballanalysis.com. So for Rich, for Ray, for myself, thank you guys for tuning in to our early breakdown of the 2025 free agency period. Tune back in on Thursday to hear the guys break down free agency from a fantasy perspective, and we'll see you then.